All right, welcome to another IAEI News Live. My name's Thomas Dimitrovich, and today we're going to do some math. We're going to take a look at calculating neutral currents. We're going to run through the math, and we're going to show you how we calculate neutral currents for various scenarios. Stay tuned, get your calculator, get a piece of paper and pencil, because it all starts now. All right, welcome back. So we're going to build on some of our previous sessions. I've got my iPad, I got my thinking paper out. Get your calculator, whether it be on your phone. Now here's what you'll need. You're going to need a calculator that can do cosine, sine, and tangent, inverse cosine, inverse sine, and inverse tangent. We'll break the math down, so we're going to try to keep it simple. If you are not familiar with complex numbers, complex variables, take a look at the video right here at this link. I'll see if I can put a link up there to it, because that will give you some background information on fundamentals that you might need for doing the math during this session. So we're going to use some of our power engineering complex numbers, and we're going to show you how we calculate that neutral current under various conditions. We'll do a balanced system first. We'll change the power factor only. We'll keep the magnitude of the impedance, but we'll change the power factor of one of the phases, loads. And then we'll keep the same power factor, but change the magnitude of the impedance, the Z, and show you the differences in neutral currents under those different scenarios. All right, so we got to start somewhere. So let's start with, don't forget your readers either. I know if you're like me, you're going to need them. So first thing we're going to do is let's just look at a system. And I think I'm going to draw it kind of larger here. We're going to think about our voltage source. All right, so this is our system. Now, what do we do with that neutral? Separately derived system, we ground it. And then this is a Y grounded supply, AC. Now, what do we know about voltages typically? What we'll see is for balanced system supplies, right? So they're 120 degrees out of phase with each other. So I have A to neutral, which is at an angle of 0. I have B to neutral, which is at an angle of 120 degrees. And then finally C to neutral, and that is a negative 120 degrees. So whenever you're dealing with systems, remember I've got 360 degrees. Every 120 degrees, I have because I'm three-phase system, I'm going to separate that into, divide 360 by 3. I'm separated by 120 degrees apart. So I can represent C to neutral as a negative 120 or a positive 240. Okay, I could also do that one C to neutral is 240 degrees because it's 120 degrees there, 120 degrees there, and that adds up to 240. But we're going to represent that C to neutral as a minus 120. So in my sources, I'll have 120 volts at an angle of 0, and this will be the A to neutral. This is VB to neutral. This will be 120 volts at 120 degrees. And this is VC to neutral, which is 120 volts at a minus 120 degrees. So those are my voltage sources for this project and this example calculation. So now what I'm going to try to do is lasso this and then shrink it and move it up there. All right, so now what I have to do is represent my load. Right, so I'll have a Y load. 1. And I know I'm terrible. Right, so that comes out, and that comes out. So this will be Z. Well, let's connect it up first. So all of these are a Z. Z, Z, and Z, and they'll be at a power factor. And we'll identify those power factor values here in a second. Put that back. All right. Okay. Put that over here, right? Look good? All right. So then we will connect. Now we're going to make some assumptions. Now we're going to connect these conductors. These are my conductors. We're going to make an assumption. The assumption is all conductors one, the same length. 2, the same size. 3, the same type. And that would be, copper, THHN, etc. So ultimately, the conductors all the same impedance. The basic assumption I'm making, that each of these conductors are the same. Now, because and the reason I say that, I'm not trying to calculate current here for you. My goal is to demonstrate the math behind calculating. We didn't draw an important conductor here. This is the neutral. So if this is VA to N up here on the left, that means that this is ZA. This is ZB. And this is ZC. That means this is IA. This is IB. And that is IC. We're going to calculate all of those. And this is I neutral. So we're going to calculate IA, IB, and IC based upon some parameters. And we're going to calculate I neutral. All right, so let's get rid of this. And we already talked about the out of phase with each other. And we've already drawn that up above. So we don't need that anymore. So this is my system. Let's do this. I'm going to make this a little larger. There we go. How's that look? Better? All right. So this is our system. Okay, what do we know? We know what VAN is. Now let's talk about Z. For our first example, ZA is going to equal to ZB is going to equal ZC, which is 10 at a 0.8 power factor. Now, ohms, right? So that's my Z. My Z is 10, and the 0.8 power factor is going to get me to my real and reactive components. Now, you might see loads described as VA at a power factor. That will get you to, you can, based upon the VA at the power factor and your voltage with your angles, you can convert all of that to current as well. But I'm going to go based on Z. The fundamentals and all the math that you need to do what you need to do, whether you have a VA at a power factor or a Z at a power factor, are going to be the same. All right, so what does 0.8 power factor? What is my theta angle for each of these loads? Is equal to the inverse cosine of 0.8. And what is that? 0.8 inverse cosine is 36.8699. So we'll say 36.87. So equals at an angle of 36.87. So I know my Z is equal to 10 at an angle of 36.87. Sound good? All right. So now IA is equal to, so we're going to calculate IA up there. We know it's equal to VAN divided by ZA. It's that simple. So IA is equal to VAN divided by ZA is equal to 120 angle of 0 divided by 10 at an angle of 36.87. And we know that is equal to 12, because 120 over 10 is 12, at an angle of 0 minus, because remember, if you go watch that video, that I did before on complex numbers, we know that when we divide, we take the angle at the top on the numerator and minus the angle on the denominator. So it's 0 minus 36.87, which is equal to 12 at an angle of minus 36.87. So that's IA. So IA is 12 at an angle of 36.87. What's IB? IB is VBN divided by ZB, and that is 120 at an angle of 120. Where do I get that from? Right here. 120 at an angle of 120 divided by 10. It's the same impedance because it's balanced at an angle of 36.87. And that equals 12 at an angle of 120 minus 36.87 is equal to 120, 36.87, subtract 83.13. 12 at an angle of 83.13. I got the 83.13. That is IB. Now let's calculate IC. Is equal to VCN divided by ZC, which is equal to 120 at an angle of minus 120. Divide that by 10 at an angle of 36.87 is equal to 12 at an angle of minus 120 minus 36.87, which is equal to 12 at an angle of, just add those two numbers and put a minus sign in front of it, so it's 156.87, so minus 156.87 degrees. All of those are degrees, and all of these are amps. So there's my system. I have 12 at an angle of 156.87. I have 12 at 83.13, and then 12 at minus 36.87. So now what do I do? So now I have to calculate IN. IN is IA plus IB plus IC. Now, if you go back and watch that video again on complex numbers, you'll know that to add, I want to put them in rectangular format. So I have to convert each of these currents, 12 at a minus 36.87 degrees, into a real and a reactive. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a table. This is what we're going to do. We're going to copy this. we're going to say copy, or create a new table, paste. All right, and then we're going to delete the little equal sign. And we know that, let's copy this again. We know that this is IA, this is IB, and this is IC. And let's do this. Duplicate. 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 Because here's what we're going to do. All right. Let's do this and give me some. I need to give me. Whoa. I need to give me some room. Bring it down. All right, so this is our magnitude at a theta. So this will be real, and this will be imaginary. And then what I'm going to do is, remember, the real is equal to I magnitude times cosine theta, and imaginary is I magnitude sine theta. Now chat it up. This is a recorded session. I should have said that in the beginning. This is a recorded session. Sine theta. Okay, so real and imaginary. So I take 12 times cosine 30 minus 36.87. So we take 12, and then 36.87 negative cosine, multiplied 9.6. So this is 9.6. And for the imaginary, or your reactive component, it's 12 times the sine of negative 36.87. 36.87 negative sine 12 times minus 7.2. Minus 7.2. I do that for IB, 12 at an 83.13. 83.13 cosine, 12 times 1.4354. 1.4354. And then I take the sine to get the reactive or the imaginary. We'll call this reactive. You know, imaginary is something we would use in math, but since we are power systems, we'll call it reactive. 83.13 and 12. 83.13 sine, 12 times 11.9138. 11.9138. All right, 156.87 negative. 156.87 negative cosine 12 times a negative 11.0354. Negative 11.0354. Now I have to do the sine. 156.87. 156.87 negative sine 12 times minus 4.7138. Minus 4.7138. Make sure that's right. Yep. All right. And be mindful of your pluses and your minuses, because that'll get you if you're not. So now, remember, delete these. remember, I neutral is equal to IA plus IB plus IC. Okay, so I have to add all of the reals and all of the reactive components. So your reals, I'm going to do this on this one. So 9.6. Delete some of these. All right, 9.6 plus 1.4354. 1.4354 is 11.0354. Subtract 11.0354, and I get a big goose egg. So let's do the other one. Minus 7.2. 7.2 negative plus 11.9138. 11.9138, add, and that's a positive 4.7138. Add to that a negative 4.7138. So it's 4.7138 minus 4.7138, and it's 0. So I neutral is equal to 0. All right, so that's a balanced system. When you add them all up, if you add 120 angle of 0 plus 120 angle of 120 plus 120 angle of negative 120, you will get 0. And if you have a balanced load, the currents all add up to 0. Now, what happens if in this system, instead of having all of these equal, what we're going to say is, we're going to do this. We're going to say VAN is equal to 120 angle of 0. VBN is equal to 120. Oh, let's do this. VBN is equal to 120 angle of 120. And VCN is equal to 120 angle of minus 120. Now, ZA is equal to 10 at a power factor of 0.95. ZB will be 10 at a power factor of 0.8. ZC is equal to 10 at a power factor of 0.8. So B and C impedances are the same, but A is the same magnitude, but it's a 0.95. Let's say you changed out the loads on phase A to a higher efficient, better power factor load, right? So what is theta is equal to, theta at 0.95 is equal to cosine -1 of 0.95. And that is equal to 0.95 inverse cosine 18.19. 18.19 degrees. Theta at 0.8 is equal to cosine of -1 of 0.8 is equal to 0.8 inverse cosine 36.87. 36.87. So IA is equal to 120 at an angle of 0 divided by 10 at an angle of 18.19. Why do we say that? Because ZA is at 0.95 power factor, which is 18.19. So that comes out to be 12 at an angle of 0 minus 18.19 is equal to 12 at an angle of minus 18.19. IB. Now, IB is exactly what it was before, so I'm going to take a shortcut here, and I'm going to lasso this. IB and IC are exactly the same. All the numbers are the same. Copy, Paste. All right, so I'm going to get rid of that. Bring this up this way. All right, now, what I need to do now is copy. We're going to do the same thing we did up above. Paste. Okay. Remember, this is IA, IB, and IC. Let's just look at those numbers. I have 12 at a negative 18.19 degrees. I have 12 at 83.13 degrees and 12 at minus 156.87. So now I need real and reactive. Remember, my real is 12 times cosine of 18.19 negative 18.19 negative cosine 12 times 11.4 and then 18.19 negative sine. So 8.19 negative sine 12 times negative 3.746. Negative 3.746. How about IB and IC? That is going to be the same as it was before. So you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to just I'm going to try something. You know what? It's going to be easier. I'm just going to calculate it. 83.13. 83.13 cosine 12 times 1.4354 1.4354, and it's probably better that I do it this way just because you can follow along. That was 83.13, right? 83.13 sine 12 times 11.9138. 156.87 negative, 156.87 negative. Don't forget the negative. Cosine 12 times minus 11.0354. And then sine 156.87 negative sine 12 times a negative 4.7138. All right, so I neutral. Add them up. I'm going to do that on here. 11.4 plus 1.4354, 1.4354 plus a negative, or sorry, I would say subtract 11.0354. 0.0354 subtract is 1.8. Remember before it was 0. Now I've got 1.8 for a real. Now reactive, I add them up. 3.746 negative 11.9138, 11.9138, 4.7138 negative, 4.7138 negative, and I get 3.454. So my neutral current, IN, is equal to the square root of 1.8 squared plus 3.454 squared, the square root of that, 1.8 squared plus square root 3.89 equals 3.89 at an angle of, and the angle theta is inverse tangent of x over r. 3.454 divided by 1.8. Theta equals 3.454, 454. 1.8. 1.8 divide inverse tangent 62.5 degrees. At an angle of 62.5 degrees. All right, so my neutral current, just because I have a power factor for my one load, for this guy right here, highlight him, just because of that character right there, that's at 0.95 instead of 0.8 and 0.8, my neutral current, now they don't add up. My neutral current is now amps, 3.89 amps. All right, so now let's do this. Let's do this. Let's take voltage. A to neutral is 120, angle of 0. The B to neutral is equal to 120 at an angle of 120. The C to neutral is 120, angle of a negative 120. So now what we'll do is we'll still play with, no, you know what? We'll play with B to N now. So we'll say ZA is equal to 10 at a 0.8 power factor. ZB is 5 at a 0.8 power factor. And ZC is 10 at a 0.8 power factor. All right, so I'm going to do this over again. Theta is equal to inverse cosine of 0.8, 0.8 inverse cosine, 36.87. It's going to be the same as it always was. Degrees, and they're all at 0.8 power factor, except now my phase B impedance is cut in half. Now, what do we know about the phase B impedance? We know the phase B impedance is going to be, since it's lower, phase B current should be higher. And again, I am assuming that my conductor lengths are the exact same length. I'm assuming that they are the same impedances, right? Okay, so let's do the math again. IA is equal to VAN, 120, angle of 0, divided by 10 at an angle of 36.87. That's equal to 12 at an angle of 0 minus 36.87 is equal to 12 at an angle of negative 36.87 amps. IB is equal to 120 over at an angle of 120 over 5 at an angle of 36.87. So 120 over 5, 120, 5 divide is 24. 24 at an angle of 120 minus 36.87, 120, 36.87, subtract 83.13. And what I want to do is 120 minus 36.87. I just want to put the math in there. So it's 120 minus 36.87 because the numerator subtracts So you take the numerator, subtract the denominator, and that is the angle. Remember, these are called polar coordinates. And when you are dividing or multiplying complex numbers like this, you put them in polar coordinates. If you're going to add complex numbers, you put them in what we call rectangular format. R, or the real, is the magnitude of the z or the I or the v or whatever it is, times cosine of the angle. And the reactive is the magnitude times the sine of the angle. All right. So IB is 24, just like we thought. We knew the current was going to go up because the impedance went down. IC is 120, angle of negative 120, divided by 10 at an angle of 36.87. So that one will equal 12 at an angle of minus 120 minus 36.87. And we'll do this one on here. So 120 minus 36.87 minus plus 156.87 is equal to 12 at an angle of minus 156.87 amps. And all of those are degrees. All right, so now we have the polar coordinates here. We have to, again, convert these to rectangular coordinates so we can add them, because I neutral is equal to IA plus IB plus IC. And I know you are probably doing this on your own on that piece of paper that I told you to get out and that calculator that I know you have. All right, so let's do this. Let's grab these and do a copy. Come down to the next page and do a paste. And we know this is IA, this is IB, and this is IC. All right, so this will be real, and this will be reactive. Now, how do we get the real? We take 12 times the cosine of the angle, minus 36.87, so 36.87 negative. Cosine 12 times is 9.6. Reactive is the sine, 36.87 negative, sine times 12. So 36.87 negative, sine 12 times minus 7.2. Don't forget the minus sign. Okay, I'm telling you, those whether they're positive or negative, every one of these angles and numbers makes a big difference. 83.13. 83.13, and this is 24. 83.13 cosine 24 times 2.87. And we go to sine 83.13. Sine 24 times 23.8277. Seems like a big number, doesn't it? It really do. All right, so IC is 12 at an angle of 156.87. So again, real and reactive, I take 12 times the cosine of negative 156.87 for the real, 12 times the sine of negative 156.87 for the reactive. 156.87, 156.87 negative cosine 12 times 11.0354. Don't forget the negative sign. 156.87, 156.87, negative sign, 12 times, 4.7138, negative 4.7138. Now, you know what? Let's just, you can plot these. Now, how would you plot that current? When you see the negatives, so in the real, this is the real axis. And this is the reactive axis. Now, when you see any of these parameters like minus 11.0354 real, minus 44.7138, that will tell you what quadrant you're in. You're either in quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, or quadrant 4. And, everybody labels them differently. So, how would you plot this? These are rectangular coordinates. So for the R, it's minus 11.0354. So So you would come into the real axis and go over minus 11. So you have a data point. How do I do that? Let's do this. Let's do it in yellow. So let's say this is 11.0354. And it's negative. And then the 4.7138 is also negative. So you come down, and let's say that this is 4.7138. So you draw that over, and you draw that down, and this is your magnitude. And that's your magnitude, and that's your angle, theta. Actually, your theta probably be that big angle like that. Right, so that at least, how would we do the angle? So remember, what's the angle of that? It's 4, so it's inverse, it's 4.7138. That's 11.0354. 4.7138, 11.0354, 11.0354. So we come over here, we say 4.7138, 7138 negative, 11.0354, 11.0354 negative, divide, inverse tangent. It's 23.1299. Now, let's do divide. 23.1299. If we looked at our angle, 23.1299 is here. You have to add 180 to that. So it's 203. So that angle is 203.13 degrees. So you have to see, I think, especially if you're on a test, or if you're even in the real world, if you're trying to understand the magnitudes and the relationships, you've got to understand how to plot these to know what the true angles are. It's the angle is not that first number that we calculated, because you have to know you're in quadrant 4, or you're in quadrant 3. Now, if the real was positive on that side and the reactive was negative, now you're in this quadrant. If the real and reactive are both negative, you're in this quadrant. If the real is negative but the reactive is positive, you're in this quadrant. And if they're both positive, you're in that quadrant. All right, so it's always helpful to plot those out and understand where you're at. So now what we're going to do is going to calculate our neutral currents. Now this will be a much more significant difference. There will be more current flowing in this neutral. Why? Because I cut the impedance in half only on one of the phases. Now I have an imbalance. All right, so I have to add up my numbers. 9.6 plus 2.87, 9.6 plus 2.87 plus a negative or subtract 11.0354. And that is 1.4346. Now I have to do the reactive. I have 7.2 negative. I have to add 23.8277, 23.8277. And I have to add a negative or subtract 4.7138. 4.7138. I have 11.9139. I want to do that again. 7.2 negative, 23.8277, and a negative 4.7138, 4.7138, 11.9139. Okay, I did the math right. Now, so I neutral is equal to the square root of the square root of the sum of the squares, 1.4346 squared plus 11.9139 squared is equal to, right, square that one, 1.4346, 1.4346 squared plus that plus square root. That is 11.999999. I'm going to call it 12. At an angle of 11.9139, 11.9139. Divide that by 1.4346, 1.4346. Divide inverse tangent, 83.13 degree amp. So now I have a significant amount of current flowing in my neutral. All right, so what did we learn so far? What did we learn? Just think about the summary here. I'm just going to real quickly. We learned that the angles make a difference, right? We learned that the angles made a difference. We also learned, I want to check my math on that one, because that just doesn't, it's amazing. It's 12 amps. Let's go back real quick. I'm just going to go back. I just want to check it again. So, $24, I got 12 at a negative 36.87, 24 at 83.13, 12 at minus 156.87. Yeah, that's got to be right. That's a lot of amps if you think about it. It's 12 amps. 12 amps flowing in the neutral. When you have an extremely unbalanced system like that. So why do we care? Why do we care? We care when we try to size the neutral. So if we want to make sure that we have the right size conductors, when we do our load calculations, when we load up panel boards, what do we always try to say? Try to keep the loads somewhat equal between phases, right? So we try to balance things. We have requirements in the code that say when you have conductors in parallel, they need to be the same lengths because the impedances are going to be different. So keep in mind that your calculations of your load calculations and sizing of the conductors is really an important piece of the puzzle. If you just look at the power factor differences, the VA differences, if you have different VAs or if you have like different loads, different impedances at different power factors, and then you have different loads on each of the phases, that it's going to probably be very rare that you don't have some current in the neutral, just because of the dynamics of a power distribution system. Now, your delta systems, like say you're supplying a motor, you have a delta system where you have a single load where each of the phases are balanced just because of the design, a little different. Those are going to add up to zero. But, or if you don't have a system, don't have a neutral out to your delta. But when you have, like, if you have a load that you have you have a single load that is produced by a manufacturer, that's Y type of a load, and each of the phases have the same impedances, you're going to have zero currents going in the neutral. But it's going to probably be very rare that you have zero currents in the neutral, just primarily because of how we wire systems and configure our power distribution systems. So, some very fundamental equations that we use today. Let's take a look at those equations. What do we know? What do we know? What do we know? What do we know? All right. So we know our systems are three-phase system. One 120. Our voltages, VAN, VBN, and VCN, the AN, 120, angle of 0. BN, 120, angle of 120. And VCN is 120, angle of minus 120. So that's a very fundamental aspect of, from our voltages perspective. You care about the angles when you want to start doing your complex numbers to add up the real and reactive components. Because remember that when you take a voltage of 120 of angle of 0 divided by the impedance that has a fixed power factor for that impedance. What is power factor? It's resistances. It's if you have an inductor, it's J omega L, and your omega is your 2 pi F. If it's a capacitor, it's 1 over J omega L, J omega C, not L. All right, so your real and reactive components are going to be comprised of impedances, resistances. And if you're going to start trying to calculate differences of currents and things of that nature, you need to understand the phase angles of your voltages and the phase angles based upon power factor and the impedances of your loads. All right. Well, hopefully we talked about cosine theta. We talked about sine theta. Understand these equations. Tangent theta. what else did we do? We talked about Z is equal to R plus JX. That's your real and your reactive component. Z is equal to the sum of the squared of R squared plus X squared. Theta is equal to inverse tangent of X over R. And that is your impedance over your reactance. You need a good scientific calculator. Make sure you understand your basics of fundamentals of trigonometry, and you can very easily calculate balanced currents in power distribution systems. But obviously, we have calculators and we have software applications that do that for us. But it's best to understand how the math is derived and how they are coming up with their numbers so that you can better understand why power systems operate the way they do. All right, so that's all I got. It was an hour. I think we covered a lot of material, in my opinion. There's a lot of math, so hopefully you caught up. And remember, you can pause this and go back. Don't forget to subscribe. Hit the thumbs up. Subscribe to the IAEI's channel. I'm looking forward to talking to you again next week. Sorry I could not be here live today. So remember to take care, stay safe, and please stay healthy. See you next week.